Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem Zayin, Daf 47 of Masechta Sukkah. Interestingly, today we talk about at the beginning we discuss Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golius, the Sveka Diyoma, that outside of Eretz Yisrael, so there's an additional day of Yom Tov at the beginning and at the end of Sukkah, Shmini Atzeres. So how does that relate to what we were discussing yesterday in terms of Rabbi Yochanan, for example, says that you're not allowed to eat your esrog until the 8th day, until Shmini Atzeres, but on Shmini Atzeres you can eat your esrog. What about in Chutz La'aretz, where day 8, we're actually in question about maybe it's day 7. So therefore, how does that halacha relate? And then we discuss Shmini Atzeres in general, and also how does the Sveka Diyoma, right, outside of Eretz Yisrael, so there's 2 days of Hoshana Rabbah. What was it called? No, there's not Hoshana Rabbah. There's Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah, of course, right? So how does that relate in terms of the 8th day? Would you eat in a sukkah? Do you eat in a sukkah on Shmini Atzeres? Also an interesting question. We discussed saying Shechayanu. Do you say the bracha of Shechayanu v'kimanu v'giyanu lezman hazeh on Shmini Atzeres? And then we discussed the mitzvah of Lina. The mitzvah of Lina is the mitzvah to sleep over in Yerushalayim the night after, right, the Motzoi Yom Tif. So we're going to discuss that halacha as well. We're going to start on Daf Mem Vav Mud Beis. From where? Where are we? Ve'onon. There we are. About 8 lines before the bottom of the page. The first one on the line is ve'onon. Ve'onon de islan treyome heichi of dinon. Friends, you got the kasha? The question is, so Rabbi Yochanan had said, for example, yesterday, that you may not eat the esrog the entire 7th day of Sukkot, but on the 8th day of Sukkot you can eat the esrog. Now, the shaila is, what about in Chutz La'aretz? What about outside of Eretz Yisrael, where we keep 2 days of Shmini Atzeres because of the Sveka Diyoma? We're not exactly sure if it's in fact the 8th day of, we're not sure if it's exactly the 8th day of Tishrei. Maybe it's the 7th day of Sukkot, or maybe it's the 7th day of Sukkot. So in that case, what do we do? Can you eat the esrog on the 8th day, or do we have to be concerned that maybe it's really the 7th day? In which case you cannot eat it. So v'anan de islan treyome. So we who have 2 days of Shmini Atzeres, heichi of dinon, what do we do vis-a-vis our ability to eat the esrog on the 8th day of Sukkot on Shmini Atzeres? Amar Abai, says Abai, Shmini Safek Shvi Osir. So says Abai, your concerns are founded, are worthwhile, that in Chutz La'aretz, on the first day of Shmini Atzeres, right, Kilu, on the 8th day, since the beginning of Sukkot, you may not eat the esrog, because we have to be concerned that maybe it's the 7th day of Sukkot. Chi Safek Shmini Mutter. However, on day 9, when, the concern is that maybe it's Shmini Atzeres that day, maybe it's day 8, so then you may eat the esrog on that day. Whereas Mereimar says that even on the first day of the last days of Yom Tif, so to speak, right, in the first of the last 2 days of Yom Tif in Chutz La'aretz, says Mereimar, you're already allowed to eat the esrog, even though there's a possibility it might be the 7th day. Okay? Bisura Avdei Kimereimar, in Surah, where Rav was from, Rav Huna, Rav Chizda, right them. So in Surah they did like Mereimar. Rav Shisha Bred Rav Idi Avid Ka'abai. Whereas Rav Shisha Bred Rav Idi did like Abai. Now, I mentioned that in Surah that's where like Rav and Rav Chizda, they were from, but Mistama Mereimar was later. So I guess we're talking about a little bit later in Surah. Okay. But anyways, Rav Shisha Bred Rav Idi did like Abaye, that on the 8th day, on day 8, since the beginning of Sukkot, i.e., we're not sure if it's day 8 or day 7, Rav Shisha Bar Rav Idi would not, it says not to eat the esrog on that day. Shmuel, where am I? Ve'uchsa ke'abai, and the halach is like Abai. Okay, that on Shvi, Safek, Shvi, then Shmini, Safek, Shvi'i, we do not eat the esrog. Fine. Amar V'Yehuda Brei, Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas. Mishmei Derav. Shmini, Safek, Shvi. Okay, so on day 8, which we're uncertain might actually be day 7, Shvi l'Sukkah v'Shmini l'Berakhot, we treat it as day 7 in terms of the obligation of sitting in a sukkah, and we're going to explain what that means in a minute. And we treat it as day 8 in terms of brachas, in terms of, we'll say like in Shmona Esrei, we'll say Shmini Atzeres, Chag Hazer, whatever it is. But in terms of the sukkah, we'll still treat it as sukkahs, as day 7, and we'll explain what that means in a minute. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Shmini Lazeh v'Lazeh, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says that in all respects, it's considered like Shmini Atzeres. With regard to brachas, we'll call it Shmini Atzeres, and with regard to sukkah, we'll treat it as Shmini Atzeres. Now says the Gemara, Meisav kuliam lo pliga di asvinon. So to clarify Rabbi Yochanan's position is that everybody agrees that you're going to sit in the sukkah. Even Rabbi Yochanan, who says that we treat Shmini Safek Shvi, the 8th day since the beginning of Sukkot, which might actually be day 7. Rabbi Yochanan says we nonetheless treat it like Shmini Atzeres, both regarding the bracha and regarding the obligation to sit in the sukkah. Says Rabbi Yochanan, says the Gemara, that even Rabbi Yochanan, who says that we treat it as day 8 vis-a-vis the sukkah, he still says that you have to sit in the sukkah. Where he disagrees is that he would say that you wouldn't make a bracha of leishev b'sukkah, ki plige livruche, where they argue, Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Yehuda Brei Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas in the name of Rav, so essentially Rav Yochanan and Rav, where they argue is regarding do you make a bracha in the sukkah. So even Rabbi Yochanan, who says that we treat it like Shmini Atzeres, and of course Shmini Atzeres is not part of Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeres you don't sit in the sukkah, but in Chutz La'aretz, where we're not sure that maybe day 8 is really day 7. So we say that everyone agrees that you're going to sit in the sukkah. The question is, do you make a bracha of leishev b'sukkah? So Rav says no, and Rabbi Yochanan says the opposite. Rav says yes, we treat it as day 7, as though it's sukkah, and you may say a bracha of leishev b'sukkah. And Rabbi Yochanan says no, we treat it as day 8, you do not make the bracha of leishev b'sukkah. Manda Amar Shvi the sukkah bruche na'im v'varchinon. So according to Rav, who says that we treat regarding sukkah, we treat day 8/7 as day 7, i.e. it's still sukkah, that you'll make a bracha. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says that no, we treat this day like day 8, well then you will not make a bracha on the sukkah. Amar Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef Nekota Rav Yochanan b'yadach. Rav Yosef says you should follow Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Rav Yosef says that you should follow Rabbi Yochanan's opinion that you do not make a bracha. The Rav Huna bar Bizna v'chol Gedolei Ador, because Rav Huna bar Bizna and all of the greatest of the generation, Iklu b'sukkah b'shmini Safek Shvi, they came to a sukkah on the 8th day of Sukkot, which we have to be concerned is maybe 7. When I say the 8th day of Sukkot, I mean Shmini Atzeres, but like the 8th day from the beginning of Sukkot, which might taka be the 7th day in Chutz La'aretz, but we're not sure. We have the Sveika Diyoma. Meisav Avu Yasvei Bruche Lo Briche, and Rav Huna bar Bizna and all the greatest of the generation, they were sitting in the sukkah and they did not make a bracha, and it was Shmini Safek Shvi. So we see that it's like Rabbi Yochanan that you do not make a bracha on Shmini Safek Shvi. But 1 second, maybe they hold, like we said the other day, Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, that once you make a bracha on the sukkah on the first day, that's it. You don't make a bracha anymore for the rest of sukkah. So maybe the reason why they didn't make a bracha in the sukkah on Shmini Safek Shvi, maybe it has nothing to do with Rav Yochanan's opinion of Shmini Lazeh v'Lazeh. Maybe it has to do with something else, which is that they already made a bracha on the sukkah a week ago, and they don't make a bracha anymore. They already did it. So Gemir Demei Offer Asu So the Gemara says, no, actually they were coming from the fields and they hadn't yet sat in a proper sukkah yet, and therefore this was their first time sitting in a proper sukkah, and even so, they didn't make a bracha on the sukkah because it was Shmini Safek Shvi, so you see it's a proof like Rabbi Yochanan. Okay. Iged Amre, there are those who say, Bruche Kule Amalo Plige Delom Varchinon. There are those who say actually that what the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav is regarding, do we treat Shmini Safek Shvi as Sukkis or as Shmini Atzeres with regard to Sukkah? So everyone agrees that you're not going to make a bracha on the Sukkah. Everyone agrees you're not going to make a bracha on the Sukkah on Shmini Safek Shvi. Ki Plige, where they argue, is Lemesav. Do you even have to sit in the Sukkah in the first place? Lemanda Amar Shiva, the Sukkah Mesav Yasvinon. So according to Rav, who says that we treat Shmini Safek Shvi like the seventh day of Sukkot with regard to the Sukkah, now what he's saying is that you sit in the Sukkah. You're not going to make a bracha on the Sukkah, but he'll say that you sit in the Sukkah. Lemanda Amar Shmini Laze Velaze, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that we treat Shmini Safek Shvi like Shmini Atzeres, so then Mesav Nami Lo Yasvinon, then we're not even going to sit in the Sukkah Bichlal on Shmini Safek Shvi. Rabbi Yosef Nekot Rabbi Yochanan B'Yadach, and says Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Yosef that you should paskin like Rabbi Yochanan because Demar Deshmaita Mani Rabbi Yehuda Brei Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas, because who's the one who's arguing on Rabbi Yochanan? It's Rav Yehuda Brei Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas in the name of Rav. Uvashmini Safek Shvi Levai Misuka Yosef, and the biggest proof is that Rav Yehuda Brei Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas himself on Shmini Safek Shvi would sit outside of the sukkah. So if even he, who's arguing on Rabbi Yochanan, and he in his argument says that you treat it like day 7, and that you would sit in the sukkah, he himself even didn't sit in the sukkah on Shmini Safek Shvi. So it says of Yosef, there's no proof bigger than that the halacha must be like Rabbi Yochanan, that you do not sit in the sukkah on Shmini Safek Shvi. So what's the halacha? Mesav Yasvinon Bruchilom Varchinon. So basically, the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan according to the first way that we understood the machlokas, which is that Rabbi Yochanan says that you do sit in the sukkah on Shmini Safek Shvi, but you don't make a bracha. Omer Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Yochanan, Omer Zman B'Shmini Shel Chag. We say Shecheyanu on Shmini Atzeres, Ve'ein Omer Zman B'Shvi Shel Pesach. But we do not say Shecheyanu on the 7th day of Pesach. So basically we say Shecheyanu, the bracha of Shecheyanu V'Kimanu V'Gyanu L'Zman Hazan, the 8th day of Sukkot, Kilu on Shmini Atzeres. But we do not say Shecheyanu on the 7th day of Pesach. V'Amar Reb Levi Bar Chama, V'Teim Reb Chama Bar Chanina Teda, and says Reb Levi Bar Chama, some say it's Tak Reb Chama Bar Chanina, that you should know L'Maise Sharei Chaluk B'Gimel Dvarim, that the 8th day of Sukkot, Kilu Shmini Atzeres, is different than the previous 7 days in 3 ways. B'Sukkah v'Lulav v'Nisuch HaMayim. With regard to Sukkah, then on Shmini Atzeres, you do not sit in the Sukkah. Now, meaning the machlokas that we just had between Rabbi Yochanan and Rab about do you sit in the Sukkah on the 8th day, not that. That is in Chutz La'aretz where we have Sveka Diyoma. We're not sure if it's really Shmini Atzeres or not. But in Eretz Yisrael, if you know for sure that it's Shmini Atzeres, so then you don't sit in the Sukkah. It's a different, Sukkot is over. V'lulav, you're no longer taking the lulav. V'nisuch hamayim, and the water libations are done. Right? During Sukkot, there's the water libations with the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar in the Beis HaMikdash. No longer on Shmini Atzeres. So, it says, Rav Chama Bar Chanina, says Rav Levi Bar Chama, some say it's Tak Rav Chama Bar Chanina, that it makes sense to say that we treat Shmini Atzeres separately, because it's different than the previous 7 days, in that we don't sit in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, we don't take the lulav, there's no longer Nisuch HaMayim, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that Nisuch HaMayim includes Shmini Atzeres, nonetheless, Shmini Atzeres is still different than the previous 7 days in 2 ways, in terms of Lulav and Sukkah. So we see that it makes sense to say that on Shmini Atzeres we treat it separately, we treat it differently, and we say Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. If that's the case, Shvi Shel Pesach Nami. But 1 second, I can make the argument that the 7th day of Pesach also should get its own Shechianu because Harei Cholok B'Achilas Matzah. Because on the 7th day of Pesach there's no chiyuv to eat matzah. Domamar Laila Rishona Chova Mikan Velech Rishus. That the chiyuv of eating matzah is only on the first night of Pesach, not after that. So we see that the 7th day of Pesach is different in that there's no chiyuv to eat matzah, whereas on the first night there is a chiyuv to eat matzah. So the Gemara says, 1 second. So the Gemara, the first answer the Gemara gives is, well, the mitzvah to eat matzah is the first night of Pesach, but the first day of Pesach, there's already no chiyuv. And therefore the 7th day is really no different than the first day. On both of them, and all of the days of Pesach, there's no obligation to eat matzah. The only time that there's an obligation to eat matzah is on the first night of Pesach. That's it. Already by the first day of Pesach, it's optional. And therefore the 7th day is no different than the first day. In both cases, it's optional anyway. So there really is no difference in that respect between day 1 and day 7, or any of the days. Whereas over here, when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, it's different than the day as well, right? Lulav, Sukkah, these are things that you do during the day. Sukkah you do also at night. But the day of Shmini Atzeres is different than the day of all the previous 7 days. Ravina Amar says, Ravina zechaluk mishelefanav zechaluk milefnei panav. Ravina says that when it comes to Shmini Atzeres is different from the day before. It's a sudden change. Right? Meaning for the first 7 days, you had Lulav, you have Sukkah, you have Nisuch HaMayim. All of a sudden you get to day 8 and it's different. As opposed to Pesach, which is day 7, the change really takes place way before day 7. The change already takes place, honestly, on day 1. So therefore it's too, or even if you want to say that, well, maybe because the chiyuv of matzah is the first night, so maybe day 2 is different than day 1, because then there's no chiyuv at all, even at night or whatever. But day 7 is already old news. There's no difference between day 7 and the 6 days prior, which is not the case by Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, all of a sudden you get to Shmini Atzeres and things change. So therefore, it makes sense to say that Shmini Atzeres Davka, you'd have a separate Shechianu, but not on the 7th day of Pesach, because there's no difference between day 7 and day 6 of Pesach. Rav Papa Omer says, Rav Papa Acha Ksiv Par, also Ksiv Parim, says Rav Papa, that it also makes sense to say that Shmini Atzeres gets his own Shechianu because throughout Sukkot, you're bringing lots of cows. Day 1, 13, day 2, 12, day 3, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. Each day it goes down by 1, but you're bringing multiple cows. Whereas on Shmini Atzeres it's just 1 cow. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Omar, says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Hocha Ksiv Bayom, Asum Ksiv, Uvayom, that when it comes to all of the other days of Sukkot, it says Uvayom, and on this day, it's connected to the previous day. Right, there's the previous day and also the next day. When it comes to Shmini Atzeres, there's no connection, there's no vav, there's nothing connecting. It's completely separate. Rav Ashi Amar Acha Ksiv Kamishpat, Hasam Ksiv Kamishpatom. Says Rav Ashi, when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, it says Kamishpat, whereas when it comes to the rest of the days of Sukkot, it says Kamishpatom. That on each of the other days it says, right, or I think there's actually Dafka on the 7th day of Sukkot, it says Kamishpatom, like all the other days. We're connecting the 7th day to all the other days. When it comes to day 8, when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, it says Kamishpat, like the law. So we see it's got its own law. It's not connected in any way to what's going on the previous days. Okay, so we see all these distinctions that make Shmini Atzeres unique on its own and therefore it makes sense to say that Shmini Atzeres would get its own Shechiyanu. So let's say that the following brisa supports Rabbi Yochanan. Again, Rabbi Yochanan says that Shmini Atzeres gets its own Shechiyanu. So let's say that the following brisa would seem to support that. Okay. On Sukkot, the cows, the rams, and the sheep are ma'akiv one another. If I understand this correctly, what it means is that if you're missing one of the cows, right, on the first day of Sukkot you have to bring 13 cows. Every day of Sukkot you bring 2 rams and 14 sheep. If you're missing even 1 ram or 1 sheep or 1 cow, forget it. Don't even bother. Don't bring any of the korbanos. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Parmein Makvin Zeh. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, if you're missing one of the cows, it's not such a big deal. Sharei mismaitim v'ochin, because every day you're bringing 1 less cow anyways. So the Torah seems to be not as concerned about cows. You start with 13, then 12, 11, 10. Each day you're bringing 1 less cow anyways. So if you miss a cow, it's not that big of a deal. Amrulo, they said to him, to which they said to Rabbi Yehuda, that's not really a good proof, because actually all of the animals, when it comes to day 8, there's less of them. On Shmini Atzeres, you only bring 1 ram, you only bring 7 sheep. So they respond to Rabbi Yehuda and they say, look, if your basis for saying that the cows are not ma'akev, they're not going to ruin everything, is because, well, they're minimizing in their numbers. Well, you could say that about the rams and the sheep as well. Because after all, on Shmini Atzeres, you bring less rams and you bring less sheep. Omer Loin, to which Rabbi Yehuda responds, Shmini Regel b'fnei atzmo. To which Rabbi Yehuda responds, says, no, don't bring me a proof from Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres is an Ander Azach. Shmini Atzeres is its own festival. It's its own separate holiday. And therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, we should only be looking at the 7 days of Sukkot. And on the 7 days of Sukkot, the rams and the sheep are constant. 2 rams, 14 sheep. However, the cows are going down in number day by day, and therefore they are not ma'akev. Shekishem sheshivas yimei achag tu'unin korban v'shir uvracha v'lina, that just like the 7 days of Sukkot have their own unique korbanos and their own unique songs that the Leviim would sing, and their own bracha, and that's sort of what we're going to scrutinize the bracha in a second. Vilina, and also the day after you offer your korban chagiga, you would sleep over in Yerushalayim, right? So assuming that on the first day of Sukkot you brought your korban chagiga, so then also the next day, right? So that basically Motzei Yom Tiv Harishan you would sleep over in Yerushalayim. It's the mitzvah of Lina. That meaning you come to Yerushalayim and you sleep there, of course, the first night. You spend Yom Tov there the first day. You also sleep there the next day, overnight. Av Shmini, so also Shmini Atzeres. Ton Korban, it has its own special korbanos. Veshir, it has its own special song. Uvracha, it has its own blessing, which we're about to explain what that is. Velina, and you stay over in Yerushalayim on Motzai Shmini Atzeres. My lavzman. So the Gemara says, what does it mean that Sukkot, when Rabbi Yehuda says that Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres are separate Yom Tivs and they each have their own brachas? What bracha are we talking about? My lavzman. Mistome, you're talking about Shechiyanu. That what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that just like on Sukkot we say Shechiyanu on the first day of Sukkot, so also on Shmini Atzeres we'll say Shechiyanu. So it's taka proof for Rabbi Yochanan who says that on Shmini Atzeres you say Shechiyanu. Friends, what do you think? Lo, because Hamazon utfila. Well, the Gemara says no. Bracha is talking about benching. It's talking about Shmona Esrei. That in benching we say Yalav Yavo, and we say Shmini Atzeres and Yalav Yavo. That in Shmona Esrei we mention Shmini Atzeres. It's not talking about Shechiyanu. Hachinami Mistaben, says the Gemara, and that even makes sense. That we're not talking about Shechiyanu, because the Sakadaitech Zman, because if it is talking about Shechiyanu, Zman Kol Shiv Mi'ika, it's not like we're saying Shechiyanu all 7 days of Sukkot. Say Shechiyanu, the first day of Sukkot, that's it. So Kilu, if Rabbi Yehuda is making a distinction between the 7 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, and he's saying that the distinction is that on Shmini Atzeres we make this, that on Sukkot we make this bracha, and on Shmini Atzeres we make this bracha. if we say that it's talking about Shechianu, but it's not like we're saying Shechianu all 7 days of Sukkot anyways, we only say it on day 1. So Halo Kasha, Di Lo Barucha Idna Mivarech L'Macher. No, you could say that you do technically, in a sense, say Shechianu all days of Sukkot, in that if you didn't make it on the first day, you can make it on the second day. Or Yom Achurin, or some other day. But still, wouldn't you have to have a glass of wine to make the Shechianu on? So let's say, from the fact that we seem to be saying that you can make a bracha of Shechianu on any day of Sukkot, well, maybe this supports Rav Nachman. The Omer of Nachman, Zman Omer Afilu B'Shuk. Rav Nachman says that the bracha of Shechianu you can even make in Shuk Machne Yehuda. You don't need a glass of wine. The Omer Ba'in and Kos, because if you say that we need a glass of wine, Kos Kol Yom Mi'ika, does he necessarily have a glass of wine every day? Dilma De'ikla Kos. So the Gemara says, meh, it's not necessarily proof for Rav Nachman who says that you could make bracha of Shechianu even in Shuk Machne Yehuda. No, maybe you do need a glass of wine, and maybe what we're saying is that every day of Yom Tif, of Sukkot, if you haven't yet said Shechianu, and you have a glass of wine, so you could still say Shechianu on a glass of wine. So it's not necessarily proof for Rav Nachman who says that you don't need a glass of wine. Maybe you do need a glass of wine, and also maybe we could still argue that when we're talking about the blessing, maybe it is talking about Shechianu, and what it's saying is that all of Sukkot you could say Shechianu in that. If you didn't yet make it, you can make it, the next day. Okay, fine. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's definitive either way. I mean, it could either be talking about Shechianu or it could be talking about Shmon Esrei and benching. So it definitely doesn't sound like it's a definitive proof for Rabbi Yochanan to say from this brisa, or to say this brisa is a support for Rabbi Yochanan that Shechianu, we say a separate Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. Fine. V'savar Rabbi Yehuda Shmini Ta'olina. Now the Gemara goes back to analyze something that we said in that brisa. Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmini Atzeres is unique, is different from Sukkot in 4 different ways. One of them was Lina, that just like on Sukkot you have to sleep over in Yerushalayim on the second night of Sukkot. So also on Shmini Atzeres you sleep over. It's the mitzvah to sleep over in Yerushalayim on the night following Shmini Atzeres. But does Rabbi Yehuda really hold that? Does Rabbi Yehuda really hold that Shmini Atzeres requires this mitzvah of Lina to sleep over the following night? But Lamaisa we learn in a brayso. Rabbi Yehuda says Rabbi Yehuda Minayin the Pesach Shenu Ta'on Lina. Says Rabbi Yehuda, how do I know that by Pesach Sheni you don't have to sleep over in Yerushalayim? Right? If you were tummy for Pesach Rishon, as we learned all about Pesach Pesachim, so you come back on the 14th day of Iyar, and you offer a Pesach Sheni, a Korban Pesach, a month late. How do we know that you do not need to sleep over in Yerushalayim that night? Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Ufanisa v'bokav alachtu alecha, that in the context of the regular Korban Pesach, it says that you will sleep over the following night, and then the next morning, on the first day of Chol HaMoed, you can go back home. Uchsiv sheishes yom tochal matzis, and it says in the very next pasuk, that you'll eat matzahs for 6 days. As sheton shishaton lina. So says Rabbi Yehuda, only in situations where you have to, that only in situations where there's going to be 6 days following. Ton lina, that is where you have to sleep over in Yerushalayim. As she'enu ton shisha, enu ton lina. But if it doesn't require 6 days afterwards, then you don't have to sleep over. Meaning, the pasuk says when it comes to Korban Pesach that it says, you'll wake up the following morning and then you'll go home. Now, and then it says immediately in the following pasuk, Sheishes Yom Tocha Matzis, that for 6 days you'll eat matzahs. So specifically in the context where for the next 6 days you're going to be eating matzahs, well then this mitzvah of Lina applies that you're going to sleep over, the night following the first day. However, when it comes to Korban Pesach, Pesach Sheni, where there's no 6 days following, there's no obligation to eat matzahs for the next 6 days, right? We don't eat matzahs for the next 6 days. You can eat as much chametz as you want. You can even eat chametz while you're eating the Korban Pesach, I believe. Definitely that day, that's for sure. So there's no chiyuv to stay over in Yerushalayim that night because there's no 6 days following the Pesach Sheni. So now the Gemara wants to ask, my lav lemute nami shmini shel chag. So wouldn't this also exclude Shmini Atzeres and say that on Shmini Atzeres there's no mitzvah of lina because there's no 6 days following? Just like by Pesach Sheni there's no 6 days following, and we say that there's no mitzvah of lina. So I would say also that when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, there's no 6 days following. So therefore, maybe by Shmini Atzeres, you do not require lina according to Rabbi Yehuda. So how come Rabbi Yehuda is saying in that brisa that there is a mitzvah of lina by Shmini Atzeres? Lo lemute Pesach Sheni dechavase. So the Gemara says no. That limud, the juxtaposition of the 6 days following the original korban, the regular korban Pesach, that's only to exclude Pesach Sheni, to say that Pesach Sheni there's no 6 days following and there's no mitzvah of lina. However, when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, there would be a mitzvah of lina. The only thing excluded from the juxtaposition of lina with eating matzah for 6 days is to exclude Pesach Sheni, that there's no mitzvah of lina by Pesach Sheni. However, there would be a mitzvah of lina by Shmini Atzeres. And this also makes sense because what's another example of a one-day festival? Shavuos. The Tanan is, we learn in the Mishnah, Bikurim Tunin Korban, that when it comes to Bikurim, which are generally brought on Shavuos, Tunin Korban, you bring a Korban Shlamim with it, Vishir, and there's a special song, Vitnufa, and you wave the Bikurim. We're going to explain it in a few minutes. Vilina, and there's the mitzvah of lina when it comes to Bikurim. So we see that according to this Mishnah, there's a mitzvah of lina even in the context of Bikurim, which is by Shavuos. Shavuos is only 1 day; it's not followed by 6 days, and we're saying that there's a mitzvah of lina. And who is the Tana who says that when it comes to Bikurim, we wave the Bikurim? Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yehuda v'kamer on lina, and he's saying in that same brisa that we require lina. So we see that when it comes to Shavuos, there's a mitzvah of lina according to Rabbi Yehuda. Even though it's only 1 day, it's not followed by 6 days. So also it makes sense to say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, even though it's only a 1 day festival, there would still be a mitzvah of lina. The Tana, as we learn in a brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda v'nachto zo tnufa. That when it says by the Bikurim that you will put it down, what does the pasuk say? It says, and he says, now I'm bringing the first fruits that God gave me, and then he puts it down before God. So now, it says the Gemara, when it says in the pasuk that you put it down, it's referring to tnufa, that you wave it around, that you wave around your basket of fruits. So then the Gemara says, wait, why are we assuming that putting it down is waving it? Maybe it literally just means putting it down. So the Gemara says, well, a different pasuk earlier on already had mentioned v'inicho, that you put it down. So we already know that you put it down. So then why does it say later on in this pasuk that you're going to put it down? We already said that you put it down. Zot tenufa. It must be that this is waving it around. So we see in this brisa that Rabbi Yehuda says that you got to wave around the Bikurim. And therefore, if he says you got to wave around the Bikurim, then this brisa, which says that you wave around the Bikurim and you also sleep over in Yerushalayim, that must be Rabbi Yehuda. And that must mean that Rabbi Yehuda holds of lina by Shavuos, and therefore it would make sense that he also holds of lina by Shmini Atzeres. We're talking about Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov here. But 1 second, maybe that brisa is Taka Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who also holds that you got to wave around the Bikurim. The Tanya, we learn in the brisa of Lokach HaKohen Atena Miyadecha, that the Kohen will take the basket from your hands, limit al Bikurim shetu'un and tenufa, which teaches us that by Bikurim, you gotta move them around, you gotta wave them around. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. My time is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. How come Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that? Also Yad Yad Mishlomim. Because we have a Gezer Shava of Yad Yad from Shlomim. It says by Bikurim that the Kohen will take the basket. And it says by Shlomim Yadav Tiviena Eisisi Hashem, that your hands will bring the fire offerings of God. It says that by Shlomim. Makan, or the offerings that go on the fire to God. Makan koin, ap lalan koin. So just like by the Bikurim, we mentioned a coin, so also by the Shlomim, there's going to be a coin. And just like by Shlomim, there's the owner of the Shlomim. So here also, by the Bikurim, it involves the owner of the Bikurim. What does that mean? What it means is that when it comes to the Bikurim, the coin the owner holds the basket, and then the coin holds it from underneath, and then they move around and wave around the Bikurim together. So we see that maybe it could actually be Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who is the author of that brisa that mentions waving around the Bikurim. So maybe it's not Davka approved for Rabbi Yehuda, but okay, fine. But okay, we do nonetheless still want to argue that according to Rabbi Yehuda, though, at least from the original brisa, that you would do the mitzvah of lina when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, because the only thing excluded from lina is Pesach Sheni. Fine. Ma'avi Allah. No. So at the end of the day, what do we do? Do we say Shechianu at Shmini Atzeres or not? Rav Nachman Omer Omrim Zman b'Shmini Atzeres. Rav Sheshes Omer Ein Omrim Zman b'Shmini Shel Chag. So Rav Nachman says that we do say Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. Rav Sheshes says that we don't say Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. V'yochso Omrim b'Shmini Shel Chag. V'yochso Omrim Zman b'Shmini Shel Chag. And the halacha is that we do say Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. Tani Kavos Rav Nachman. We have a brisa supporting Rav Nachman that we do say Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. Shmini regel b'fnei atzmo linyan pezer keshev, as we saw in, I believe, Gemara Yoma, that the 8th day of Sukkot, right, Shmini Atzeres, is considered its own festival with regard to pezer keshev, with regard to the following 6 things that have an acronym of pezer keshev. Payis b'fnei atzmo gets its own lottery, which means that for the first 7 days of Sukkot, basically each mishmar, there were 24 mishmaros, each mishmar they would just go through the order of mishmaros, and each one would do a cow, right? So each mishmar would do 1 cow. Now there were 70 cows, and 24 times 3 is 72. So each mishmar would basically do 3 rounds of cow offering, but 2 mishmaros would miss out in the last one, in the last round. Fine, right? But comes Shmini Atzeres, all of a sudden they would go back to doing the lottery of which mishmar would offer the cow on Shmini Atzeres, because it's only 1 cow. Zman b'fnei atzmo on Shmini Atzeres you say Shechianu. So there you go. So we see that we're saying that on Shmini Atzeres you say Shechianu. Regel b'fnei atzmo, it's considered its own festival, and that you say, in Shmona Esrei and benching, it has its own mentioning, like Ya'aleh v'Yavo. Korban b'fnei atzmo, it has its own korbanis. Shira b'fnei atzmo, it has its own songs. Bracha b'fnei atzmo, and also, Rashi says Regel b'fnei atzmo, it's its own festival, and that we don't sit in the sukkah anymore. That for the first days we sit, right, for the sukkahs we sit in the sukkah. On Shmini Atzeres we don't, and then Bracha b'fnei atzmo we say like es Yom Shmini Atzeres Chag Hazeh in the Tfilis. Okay, fine. Cheved, that was Daf Mem Zayin of Masechta Sukkah. So we spent the first part of the daf really kind of discussing Sveka Diyoma kinds of things, right? In Chutz La'aretz, when we have 2 days of Yom Tif, right? So when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, we're not sure if maybe it's actually the last day of Sukkot. So how does that relate in terms of being able to eat your esrig on the 8th day on Shmini Atzeres? So Abai says, look, in Chutz La'aretz we have to be concerned that maybe it's the 7th day and you can't eat your esrig until the 9th day, right? Till the 2nd day of Sveka Diyoma. Whereas Meremar had said that you could even eat the esrog on the 8th day in Chutz La'aretz, which might be the 7th day. Then we saw machlokas between Rav Yehuda Brei, Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas Omer Rav, and Rav Yochanan regarding Shmini Safek Shvi, right? The 8th day of Sukkot in Chutz La'aretz, which might actually be the 7th day. Rav, right, Rav Yehuda Brei Rav Shmuel Bar Shila says the name of Rav that with regard to Sukkah we treat it as day 7. However, with regard to Bracha we treat it as day 8. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says that we treat it as day 8 regarding both Sukkah and Bracha. What Bracha is that we'll say Shmini Atzeres. We'll mention Shmini Atzeres in davening and in benching on its own. And the question is, what does it mean? What's this machlokas between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan regarding Sukkah? So the first way to understand is that both Rav and Rabbi Yochanan say that you're going to sit in the Sukkah on day 8, which might be day 7. The only thing is that Rabbi Yochanan says that we consider it like day 8 in that you wouldn't make a bracha on it. You wouldn't say make a bracha b'leishev b'sukkah. The other way to understand the machlokas is that everyone agrees that you do not sit in the Sukkah. I'm sorry, everyone agrees that you do not make a bracha on the Sukkah. The question is, do you actually sit in the Sukkah? Rav says yes, you sit in the Sukkah because we treat it like day 7, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says we do not sit in the Sukkah on day 8. That might be day 7 because we treat it as day 8. And we say that le'alacha, what we do is, like Rabbi Yochanan according to the first way, which is that you would sit in the Sukkah on day 8, which might be day 7, but you do not make a bracha of leishev basukkah. Then the question was, what about shecheyanu? Do you say the bracha of shecheyanu on Shmini Atzeres? So Rabbi Yochanan says, yes, you do, because Shmini Atzeres is its own kind of thing, and we brought a whole bunch of proofs to say that Shmini Atzeres is different than the rest of the 7 days of Sukkot. For example, that we don't bring the lulav or sit in the sukkah or do nisach hamayim. According to Yehuda, you do nisach hamayim, but you still wouldn't sit in the sukkah or shake the lulav. We also mentioned that it's different with regard to korbanos, and it's different with regard to all sorts of different different psukim and things to say that Shmini Atzeres is different than the first days of Sukkot, and therefore it makes sense to say that you would say Shechianu on its own. We brought a brisa to try to prove that, which wasn't particularly definitive. However, one thing that we mentioned in that brisa was that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is a mitzvah of lina when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, which means that on the night following Shmini Atzeres, you would sleep over in Yerushalayim. And we made a distinction, right, when it comes to Pesach Sheni. When it comes to Pesach Sheni, so you would not, there's no mitzvah to stay over in Yerushalayim the night following. We wanted to say that maybe, just like by Pesach Sheni, there's no mitzvah to sleep over in Yerushalayim, so maybe also by Shmini Atzeres there's no mitzvah to stay over in Yerushalayim, but we said that no, that halacha is limited to Pesach Sheni. Only by Pesach Sheni, there's no mitzvah of lina. However, there is a mitzvah of lina, both by Shmini Atzeres as well as by Shavuos, even though they are only one-day festivals. And finally, we saw machlokas between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes regarding saying Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. Rav Nachman says you do, Rav Sheshes says you do not, and we paskin like Rav Nachman that you do say Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. Chaver, that was daf 47 of Masechta Sukkah. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.